The greatest crisis facing the Western world is not the strength of our enemies. It is the fundamental, catastrophic failure of strategic focus within the United States. While the Moscow-Beijing axis operates with ruthless, singular clarity, the American defense apparatus, the world's most vital guarantor of global security, is dangerously distracted by internal political battles and peripheral concerns. This profound crisis of priorities is the root cause of our vulnerability, and it is actively opening the door for a global conflict. The very notion that a nation facing the imminent threat of a two-front war, a coordinated challenge to its global supremacy, can afford to indulge in internal non-military preoccupations is an absurdity. Yet, that is exactly what we are seeing. The energy and attention of the highest levels of the current administration are being diverted into debates about military aesthetics and a minutia of cultural policies. We heard the leader himself publicly voice his aesthetic distaste for modern, highly effective stealth destroyers, expressing a desire to return to the concept of the battleship, a relic of a bygone era. This preference for outdated, symbolic military hardware over modern, integrated force projection is not just an opinion, it's a terrifying signal of a complete detachment from the realities of the modern battlefield. The time spent debating military social policies or the aesthetics of stealth technology is time that should have been spent implementing the critical, systemic updates necessary to counter the new threats identified by analysts at the Rand Corporation. This strategic distraction has created a fatal gap between the army the US has and the army it needs. While the US military is bogged down in internal signaling and ideological disputes, the Russian military has mastered low-cost, high-volume warfare, the drone swarms, the electronic warfare (EW), and the use of guided aerial bombs (CABs). This failure to pivot the massive defense apparatus is a direct result of a leadership that is looking inward rather than outward. This political blindness has crippled America's ability to act decisively. The resources that should have been allocated to solving the massive drone gap, the lack of low-cost, mass-produced unmanned systems vital for surviving the war in Ukraine, were instead spent on debates that have no bearing on combat readiness. The failure to provide industrial guarantees to drone manufacturers based on the successful model of Franklin D. Roosevelt's B-24 program during WW II is a policy disaster. The energy of the nation's political class is consumed by peripheral issues, leaving the core military vulnerability exposed. The external consequences of this focus are immediate and catastrophic. The political chaos and internal fixation are being interpreted by the Moscow-Beijing axis as a clear, unmistakable signal of weakness and indecision. When the US leadership is seen to be preoccupied with internal squabbles that have no bearing on military strength, its adversaries gain confidence. This political vacuum is not a minor inconvenience, it is the fundamental mechanism that enables aggression. The Axis is relying on the certainty that a nation so fractured by internal cultural divisions will be unwilling and unable to mount a unified, swift response to a coordinated external attack. The failure to address the genuine systemic threat is the fastest way to invite a global conflict on terms that will be profoundly and tragically unfavorable to the democratic world. We have established that the highest levels of the US administration are consumed by internal political distractions. But this crisis of leadership has resulted in a direct, catastrophic failure on the military front, doctrinal stagnation. NATO is lethally unprepared to fight the war that Russia has mastered. The military alliance is still focused on fighting the last war, a conventional model that has been rendered obsolete and suicidal by the brutal realities of the Ukrainian battlefield. The current European and American military doctrine is fundamentally rooted in the air-land battle concept, a doctrine perfected during the Cold War and flawlessly executed during the Gulf War. It relies on swift maneuver, total air dominance, and the use of high-tech, high-cost platforms like the Abrams tank and the F-series fighter jets. This doctrine assumes that air superiority is guaranteed and that the enemy's command structure will be instantly neutralized.
The Ukrainian counteroffensive of 2023, however, proved this model is a dangerous illusion. Against a prepared, entrenched enemy using massive numbers of mines, drone surveillance, and electronic warfare, the old doctrine leads only to catastrophic losses without territorial gains. The reality Russia faces is defined by three factors that NATO has failed to integrate: drones, electronic warfare, and guided aerial bombs, CAVs. This creates the drone gap, the single most immediate tactical vulnerability of the alliance. European armies critically lack the low-cost, mass-produced FPV drones necessary for forward surveillance and attack. They are also dangerously short on the integrated counter-drone systems and EW gear required to survive a Russian drone swarm. The current strategy, tragically demonstrated in the past, involves using multi-million-dollar air defense missiles to shoot down cheap, disposable enemy drones, an economically ruinous and utterly unsustainable tactic. Russia's army is fighting a war of industrial attrition, while NATO's armies are still configured for a war of surgical, high-cost precision. This doctrinal stagnation is exacerbated by the self-inflicted wounds of political distraction. The time and immense budget that should have been spent implementing the critical, systemic updates recommended by experts like the Rand Corporation were wasted on peripheral issues. When the head of the administration publicly discusses his aesthetic distaste for modern stealth ships and muses about the return of the battleship concept, it signals a profound disconnect. It proves that the leadership's focus is on symbolic, nostalgic military hardware rather than the functional, asymmetric tools required to fight and win the next war. This failure to pivot the massive US defense apparatus is a political, not a technological issue. The consequences of this failure are existential. Russia's attack will succeed initially because it will exploit this outdated doctrine. The Russian command will rely on its experience in overwhelming positions with massed CAVs launched from safe distances, followed by light, disposable infantry using infiltration tactics that bypass the very large, costly formations NATO is trained to defend. NATO's logistical rear, currently undefended by sufficient drone and EW coverage, will be immediately compromised by long-range Russian reconnaissance and attack drones. By failing to adapt its doctrine, NATO has essentially gifted Russia the initial military advantage in any potential European conflict. The only way to counter this is a total, immediate overhaul of the military's priorities, moving decisively from the expensive illusions of the last century to the low-cost, high-tech realities of the present one.
We have analyzed the failure of NATO's military doctrine, but the most profound strategic vulnerability is economic, and it lies hidden within the global supply chain. The US and its allies are dangerously reliant on China for the one thing that powers all modern military systems: basic microchips. This is the Chinese chip hook, a form of weaponized dependency that gives Beijing an instant off switch for NATO's war effort. This is not about the cutting-edge processors that dominate the headlines. The problem is far more fundamental. China controls the manufacturing of older, less glamorous, but absolutely vital semiconductor components. These include basic microcontrollers, power management chips, diodes, transistors, and various sensors. According to industry analysis, China dominates a staggering 30 to 40% of the global market for these older semiconductors. These components are the digital bloodstream of the modern war machine. They are found in every single piece of military hardware, from the FPV drones that define the current battlefield to the guidance systems of long-range missiles, the power regulation systems of communication hubs, and even the electronic circuits in heavy armor. This reliance on Chinese manufacturing presents a catastrophic vulnerability. If a major conflict were to erupt, Beijing would not need to engage in traditional warfare against the Western supply chain. It would simply impose a comprehensive export ban on these components to NATO nations, while guaranteeing supply to Russia. The consequences would be instantaneous and strategically devastating. The United States possesses the largest, most technologically advanced arsenal in the world, but it would suddenly be unable to repair, replace, or build new military systems that rely on these ubiquitous, low-cost components. The speed of replacement is the crucial factor. While the US and Europe have the technological capacity to design these chips,
they do not possess the necessary mass manufacturing capacity to replace the high volume of components that the Chinese factory produces. The military's vast logistical network would be starved of replacement parts, forcing a rapid, systemic decline in readiness. The ability to launch drones, the quick repair of damaged vehicles, and the basic function of forward communication centers would all be paralyzed. This reliance on Chinese components is not an unfortunate logistical detail. It is a profound structural flaw that grants China decisive leverage in any conflict. This technical dependency is the central pillar of the Moscow-Beijing two-front strategy. The expert community understands that China is using this leverage to guarantee Russia can tie up US resources in Europe, secure in the knowledge that NATO cannot sustain a high-intensity conflict without its Chinese-manufactured components. This is pure supply chain warfare, a non-kinetic form of attack that can achieve the same result as a strategic bombing campaign. By failing to secure its own industrial sovereignty over these basic but vital components, the US has placed the entire collective defense of the West in a state of terminal dependence on its main geopolitical rival. The time for denial is over. The only way to survive the next war is to cut the hook. We have established the technical dependency on China, a strategic weakness that gives our adversaries a tactical off switch. But the second, equally catastrophic failure of the United States is one of sheer volume: the drone deficit. This is not a complex technological problem. It is a fundamental failure of leadership to understand the required scale of modern warfare, and the gap between what the US military requires and what it is acquiring is so vast that it guarantees a major strategic lag. The quantitative evidence of this failure is staggering. While the war in Ukraine has unequivocally proven that the future of warfare is dominated by massed, low-cost, unmanned aerial systems, UAS, the US military is acquiring these systems at a rate that is absurdly insufficient. Consider the hard, undeniable facts. The US military acquired less than 4,000 drone platforms in an entire year. Now, contrast that with the industrial capacity of its rivals and allies. A single Ukrainian defense company can produce 4,000 drones in a single day. This difference, a failure of output by a factor of 365, is not a gap, it is a strategic chasm. It proves that the US is currently incapable of sustaining a modern, high-intensity conflict against a technologically capable rival. The reason for this industrial paralysis is clear and rooted in a simple lack of political commitment. The defense industry is governed by market realities, and industry leaders will not invest the billions required to retool factories for mass drone production without a massive long-term guarantee of purchase from the government. This is a lesson that should have been learned in the 20th century. Look at the historical example of Franklin D. Roosevelt and the B-24 Liberator bomber program. The government did not ask industry to try to build bombers. It provided an absolute non-negotiable contract guarantee to Henry Ford. If you build one bomber an hour, we will buy every single one. That level of clarity is necessary now. Without a clear, multi-year, multi-billion-dollar commitment from the administration to purchase thousands of these low-cost systems, the risk-averse defense industry will continue to focus on producing high-margin, high-cost conventional weapons, leaving the nation dangerously exposed. This industrial failure is a direct consequence of the crisis of strategic priorities we analyzed earlier. The time and energy spent on internal culture wars or the aesthetic debate over ships, the leader's preference for a pretty battleship over a functional stealth destroyer, should have been dedicated to implementing this vital industrial policy. The failure to pivot the massive defense apparatus is a political, not a technological issue. While experts from the Rand Corporation scream that the military doctrine is outdated and requires immediate investment in UAS, the leadership is focused on peripheral issues. This neglect guarantees that Russia and China will maintain a decisive immediate advantage on the low-altitude battlefield. The strategic consequence of this drone deficit is existential. It is the core factor that enables the Moscow-Beijing two-front strategy. The Axis knows that even if NATO fields its full complement of advanced ground forces, those forces will be tactically blind and highly vulnerable to annihilation from above. This lag is not a temporary inconvenience, it is the strategic vulnerability that our rivals are banking on. The US is not prepared to project force effectively in a conflict defined by overhead surveillance and low-cost precision strikes. The only way to survive the next war is to cut through.
We have meticulously analyzed the crisis of priorities, the failure of military doctrine, and the strategic vulnerability of our supply chain. Now we must deliver the final, inescapable verdict on the consequences of this neglect. The catastrophic failure of the democratic world was not a technological lapse. It was a profound failure of political will to adapt to the changing face of war. By choosing procrastination over preparedness, the West has done the unthinkable. It has made the two-front war a statistical certainty. The threat is no longer theoretical. The Moscow-Beijing axis is not waiting for permission. They are operating under the assumption that the West's inaction is a green light for global escalation. We are facing a synchronized, integrated challenge to the entire post-Cold War order. Russia's role is to act as the massive, resource-consuming diversion in Europe, pinning down US air and naval assets. China's role is to exploit the resulting vulnerability to make its decisive move on Taiwan. The strategic cost of delaying decisive action in Ukraine has metastasized into a global crisis. We failed to solve the Russia problem when it was contained, and now it has compounded into a simultaneous existential threat thousands of miles apart. This situation reveals the true tragedy of our strategic stagnation. The vast military machine of the United States, the guarantor of global peace, is fatally vulnerable on two counts. First, tactically. We are prepared for a conventional war of the 20th century, while Russia will fight a war of drones, cabs, and low-altitude infiltration. Our ground forces will be exposed and overwhelmed by asymmetric swarm tactics that our existing doctrine is not equipped to handle. Second, logistically. We are cripplingly dependent on the Chinese supply chain for basic microchips and drone components. The Axis knows it can instantly paralyze NATO's ability to wage a modern war simply by cutting off the necessary low-cost electronic components. This single strategic dependency turns our industrial might into a static liability. The Axis is relying on the fragmentation of NATO, a certainty built upon the political subversion and the Trojan horse strategy we have observed across Europe. They are counting on internal political bickering and the lack of consensus to delay a unified Article 5 response, thus ensuring the success of their military goals. The window of opportunity, the critical time between NATO's current unreadiness and its future modernization, is closing